Vietnam. And strangely enough, that turned out to be the genesis of her interest in Antarctica. Because on that trip, she developed appendicitis or something like that, and had her appendix out after a lot of toing and froing and coming back to New Zealand with anxious parents trying to arrange stuff. But it was a harrowing time for Hanne, and she thought to herself, how can I make something good out of what is this horrible thing that has happened? Mucked up the holiday for myself and others who were travelling with me. And she thought, well, if you go to Antarctica, you had to have your appendix out, so why don't I go to Antarctica instead? And she came to me and said, well, Dad, I really want to go to Antarctica. I've had my appendix out. How do I get there? And me being typical academic, I said, you apply for a grant or something. Anyway, Hanne got onto a course at in Canterbury University, and that was over a summer, I think a 3-month period or 2-month period, and part of that was to go down to Scott Base, and you spent, a week down there?
Couple of weeks.
Couple of weeks, yeah. Anyway, that really sparked something in her, and as a result of that, she has gone on to do honours degree and master's degree, and now a PhD in Antarctic studies. But typical of Hanne, it's not a straightforward subject that she is looking at. She is looking at Antarctica from the point of view of advertising and commercialisation. And I'm sure she's got some interesting thoughts in this area. So, Hanne, it's your one.
Thank you, and thanks for coming, everyone. Often when I'm giving a talk like this, it's sort of out in this middle of the Southern Ocean with the floor going like this, so it's quite nice to be flat and in a building that's not rocking all around. So I thought I'd give you a bit of an overview of the project that I've been doing, and we've got a bit of time at the end for some questions as well. But first of all, Antarctica. The word itself conjures up these images of pristine icescapes, of heroic figures battling against the blizzard, and of the threat of masses of melting ice. But billboards and dollar signs? Not so much. Commercialisation is often seen as anathema to Antarctic values. And the continent is protected from a lot of different exploitation by the Antarctic Treaty system. Nevertheless, Antarctica has been sold metaphorically in a whole range of ways ever since the first human interaction with that place. And the associations that come to mind when you hear that word Antarctica are really central to that selling. And that's where my project comes in. So I'm analysing representations of Antarctica in print advertising media, looking at what sort of visual elements are there, what sort of language is used, to find out the sort of themes that keep coming back and the narratives that have been associated with that place at various points in time. And through that you can find out the ways that we've imagined and thought about this continent at the bottom of the world. And they do, of course, come in many guises, these imagined versions of Antarctica. Up here, I have 4 of the main themes that we'll come back to a little later on. So from my collection of just over 300 adverts so far, these are 4 ideas that just keep coming back and back. But before we get to those, you might be wondering, why look at advertisements? Well, let's start here with this continent, Antarctica, to begin with. Some of you have just come from upstairs from my dad's talk about going to Antarctica. Most people never do. It's sort of that white area at the bottom of the map, if it's even there on the map at all. Half the time they cut it off at 60 degrees. So if most people don't go, the experience of that place is mediated through a whole range of different texts. They could be things like diaries. So a famous one is the expedition diaries of Robert Falcon Scott, which many people have read. Could be things like photographs from the continent, things like films. And if you've seen Happy Feet and Happy Feet 2, you might know a little bit about krill because of Will and Bill. They did a lot to raise the profile of those little animals. Things like novels as well. So this one here was written by Lawrence Fernley, who went to Antarctica with the New Zealand Artists in Antarctica program. Or things like advertisements. And some of these have been looked at more than others. This ad here is probably one of the most famous Antarctic texts, actually. And it's most likely apocryphal as well. Most likely never appeared. But it's been recycled time and time again for many different purposes. Even the city of Detroit ran a version trying to get people to go and live in Detroit. So it's quite dangerous and not very pleasant, but you should come anyway. So some of these have been looked at. Things like the diaries have been studied many times. Things like advertisements, not so much. And one of the reasons for that is advertisements are quite ephemeral. So they appear, and they've got a very short shelf life. For instance, a lot of times when old magazines are kept, that it was thought that ads weren't really useful, so they tore them out before keeping them. But they're actually a really interesting thing to look at because adverts that have Antarctica in them showcase the commodification of Antarctic imagery. And they also provide a shortcut to ideas that are already out there in common circulation. So, as scholar Judith Williamson puts it, those ads feed off the iconography of the present at the same time as perpetuating it. If you're making an advertisement, you know people won't look at it for very long. You want them to get the message very, very quickly. You don't give new ways of thinking about things that are so challenging. So if things are getting used in advertising, it means they're already out there, already being thought about. So that's why I'm looking at advertisements. But advertisements are also really interesting in a South Polar context, because ever since the signing of the Antarctic Treaty back in 1959, capitalism and commerce have been seen as really anathema to Antarctic values. Antarctica is usually painted as a place of science where only scientists go, which is not actually the case. But a lot of that perception is related to the treaty. So that treaty was a remnant of the Cold War. We had 7 nations already making claims in Antarctica by this time. Australia has that big yellow part along the coast because Douglas Mawson mapped it some 100 years ago. We had France, Norway, in the peninsular area overlapping claims from Chile, Argentina and Britain. And this part here is the Ross Dependency, which New Zealand is in charge of. So if you hear our far south, that they're talking about. So these claims had already been made, but there was this big unclaimed sector. And the USA was interested in it, and USSR was interested in it, but neither wanted the other one to have it. So that was partly what made this treaty come to being. So the treaty, it doesn't get rid of these claims, but it puts them on ice, and it says, if you don't want to recognise them, you don't have to. If you're not from New Zealand or Australia, you probably look at this map and say, oh, that's all made up. If you're from a claimant country, you'll say it's yours. But the treaty puts those on hold. It also sort of said Antarctica is a place for peace, for science, cooperative science, where you share your findings, and that we're not going to think about those claims anymore. So that was back in 1959. That doesn't mean that this perceived incompatibility of commercialism and Antarctica has gone away. You can't go down there, put up a real estate sign and say, I'm going to sell you this square of ice or something. But these ideas are central to debates that are to do with resources, to do with tourism as well. And if we're looking at advertisements, these kind of ideas come through there too. And I already mentioned Antarctica is usually thought of as just for scientists. We have 40,000 tourists a year going down, usually to the peninsula area up this way. And there's a whole lot of support staff as well. So somewhere like Scott Base, you've got to have your engineers, you've got to have your cooks, your domestics, science techs as well. But that's the dominant cultural frame through which we view it. But it's not the only one. And it doesn't mean that it's always been that way either. So if we go back to think about the very first people who were travelling to Antarctica and doing different activities down there, we end up with pictures something like this. Actually, the history of human interaction with Antarctica is very much the history of human exploitation of that area. Because the first people going down there were doing so looking for things like these guys, Antarctic fur seals, and going further and further south, looking on sub-Antarctic islands and down around the continent as well. And it was these guys who were doing the first sightings. So 1820, 1821, we have Nathaniel Palmer from the USA, Edward Bransfield from England, Admiral Fabian von Bellingshausen from Russia, all sighting the Antarctic peninsula area. And that opened up a period where people came down looking for guys like these. Also happened south of New Zealand, in the New Zealand sub-Antarctic islands, places like Campbell Island and the Auckland Islands. But what that meant was, if you knew where these resources were, you wouldn't want anyone else to know. So a lot of the early maps and logbooks are actually fabricated or have deliberate errors in them. So if they were stolen, people couldn't find the hunting grounds. That was the first reason for sealing. And not long afterwards, whaling started heading further south as well. And from 1904, we had shore-based whaling stations in the Antarctic. Places like Deception Island and South Georgia, a little bit further north. And this is one of the early adverts here, this one for something called whalebone, which was the baleen, which they used to make clothing and corsets. And this brand was actually called Antarctic whalebone and was stamped with that branding across it. And another thing that was harvested from down there was actually penguins down on Macquarie Island. That was an industry by Joseph Hatch, who was a New Zealander, but of course Tasmania is now in charge of Macquarie Island, and so they were giving out the permits, but same sort of idea, rendering them down to give oil to use for the sort of things that we'd use synthetic oils today, all sorts of lubrication, or with these guys too, like even oil for lighting lamps and things back home. So even though it was right down the end of the world, these products were mostly making their way back to the northern hemisphere. So some of those things, we had seal products, whale products, penguin oil, quite a few proposals to go down and mine ice as well. Small amounts have been taken to brew into mostly beer or other kind of alcoholic beverages. More recently too, things like fish and krills, and we've got bioprospecting as well. So when you're going down and looking for different living organisms and things that you might be able to do with that back home as well. So in terms of fishing, that's managed by Commission for the Conservation of Antarctic Marine Living Resources, which was established in 1982. So they're in charge of everything in the ocean. But in terms of advertising, you get things like this one here, Eco Krill Oil, and it's usually got those images of penguins and icebergs and really pure-looking environment. With the fish, not so much. They don't normally say quite where it's come from, but the krill oil, very much so. Another thing that I've got some interesting ads from is something like called bioprospecting. So that's sort of a hybrid activity which is part science, part industry, and it's where you're looking for living organisms and with commercial intent with those. We've got about 200 companies involved in that sort of activity at the moment. And it can cause some controversy, because under the Antarctic Treaty system, the idea is that you will have freedom of information to findings. But of course, if you're going down and wanting to patent your findings, that's not really compatible with that either. And this is one example of the sort of product that comes out of that activity. In this case, we had Antarcticene, which was found underneath one of the really large glaciers, and they thought, oh, we'll put it into a skincare product. This idea of ice moving very slowly, freezing time on your face. And there's some brilliant ads from this one. So if it's so resilient, so powerful that it can survive in such extreme conditions as the Antarctic, just imagine what it could do for your skin. So yes, the link to Antarctica is quite tenuous, but it's at the forefront of a lot of that kind of advertising as well. You don't have to have necessarily an Antarctic link though to associate your product or your service with Antarctica. I just popped this one in because I often get asked about other resources, mineral resources. So back in the 1980s, there was an agreement drawn up called CRAMRA, which was led by New Zealand actually, which was supposed to be managing the resource activity for mineral resource in the Antarctic. But France and Australia walked away at the last minute, so we don't have that. Instead, we've got from 1991, Madrid Protocol. And everything we think of in Antarctica these days, like you can't go and put your rubbish out on the sea ice, you can't have sled dogs or bring in any introduced animals down there, or if you're putting up a base, you need to have a plan for removing that base. That's all related to this one here from 1991. So there are mineral resources in Antarctica, but that's not something that's being taken out at the moment. As I mentioned, it's not only things from Antarctica or with a direct link that are valuable if we're thinking about commercialisation and advertising. And Antarctica has been used metaphorically in a whole range of ways. And it's also been really valuable because of the stories that have come from that place. So ever since the very first explorers ventured down there, we call the heroic era from about 1899, when big names like Robert Falcon Scott, Roald Amundsen, Ernest Shackleton, Douglas Mawson, Nobu Shirazi, when they were heading down into the interior of the continent, they were all taking with them photographers, specifically to document those stories, and they had deals with newspapers back home as well. So they would be, sometimes the whole expedition was financed by the press, sometimes partly, with this agreement that you give us the photos and we have exclusive right to the story and we'll provide you what you need to go down. So ever since the very first exploration, it's been a very tight relationship with that media. Even though these guys were stereotypically known as men of action, walking across the ice, planting flags, they really needed to be able to tell people that story as well. So telling with those photographs or telling with the official versions, the official narratives when they got back again. And for that reason, ghostwriting was very common as well. Even Ernest Shackleton, you might have heard of his book South or Heart of the Antarctic. Both of those were written by journalists from Lyttelton in New Zealand because they needed to sound exciting. You can't just do something new. You actually need to be able to make it sound like it's really exciting to follow what you're doing. If you just go for a walk in the snow and come back, well, no one really wants to read it. And that was Amundsen's problem, actually. So he was the first to reach the South Pole, but he lost all his media deals because the publisher just said, you're just not making this sound exciting enough. So if you're planning on something, make sure you have that drama element. This is an example of Carsten Borchgrevink. His expedition was fully financed by George Nunes, who was a newspaper magnate and had magazines like The Strand. So he paid for everything, and Borchgrevink was quite happy because he got a ship and he got his men. With those images as well that were being taken, it didn't take very long for them to also appear in advertising material. This one is an example from 1913 from The Strand magazine. And in this case, that was the first time Robert Falcon Scott's diaries had been published since he perished in Antarctica a couple of years earlier. So these days you can go and buy it as a bound volume. They put it out as a serial in this magazine over a series of months. And there was a lot of interest in the story, so of course the magazine sold really well. And some of those products that were sent down with Captain Scott, they thought, well, we also can capitalise on this. So for instance here, for the gramophone, you'll see their lovely little logo with the Scotty dog and the gramophone. Well, these guys, when they were in the Antarctic, posed one of their huskies with the gramophone. They thinking that it might be used later in advertising. And they actually wrote to the company too and said, Mr. Ponting, our photographer, took some photos of the Siberian sledging dogs listening to the gramophone, similar to your well-known fox terrier. So they were communicating with these sponsors saying, well, we're organising this material for you. It was not very uncommon. So the guys, even as they were in Antarctica, knew they were part of this media machine and were giving thought to the future promotional use. Another sort of image that shows that is... no, he's not there. Okay, there's some other images that show that too, from Nielsen as well. But of course, you didn't necessarily have to be linked with the Antarctic to use Antarctica in your advertising. This one again from New Zealand, down in Littleton in 1909, when Shackleton was about to return from the Nimrod expedition. And everyone was awaiting this arrival, and Ballantyne's, so there's still a store down in Christchurch now, they made this beautiful advert with the penguin, farthest south, and they're sort of building this image of Antarctica. It's got glorious sunsets, bitter cold, biting blizzards, British pluck, and heroic enterprise. So you get that picture in your head, and then, well, what do you need to go there? Finest furs from the north, only available at Ballantyne's. But a lot of those themes come back even today in advertising. So ideas about the aesthetics of the place, the extremity, colonial context, which links a lot with heroism, and that exploration as well. So some of those other ones that are showing you some of those endorsements. This one's from a wee bit later. This is Admiral Byrd, who was from the USA. So he was doing similar things to these earlier explorers. Actually, he sent out 11,000 letters just trying to get people to pay for his expedition. His first 2 expeditions were fully private, funded by sponsors, such as Grape Nut Cereal. On the second expedition too, he actually took 3 cows with him because he knew that they would make good headlines. Everyone wanted to know how the cattle were getting on. So he was really a master of finding ways to get those headlines. And in this case, he's saying, this is the oil that Byrd chose, so you should definitely choose it too. It will work really well. And that brings us to some of the more modern day adverts and some of the themes that come out in these. Because one of those that still remains is of Antarctica as a place for heroes. And this idea of man versus nature, really going out and conquering a landscape. And this one here is Sony sponsoring an expedition with Bloggy. But that idea of Antarctica as a place for heroes really is one of the foundation myths of that continent. Antarctica, of course, a place that had no native human population. So these heroic era explorers going down, their stories still remain quite powerful. And the imagery too. So this one in the corner to compare is a picture from Frank Hurley from Home of the Blizzard, where Douglas Mawson was. And it's really much that leaning into that wind, fighting against that blizzard. And that's used time to time again. And this one here is a more recent one too. This is one of my favourite ones to do with heroism. So this is to do with sponsorship and making a link with the Antarctic. So we had this expedition going to the South Pole called Walking with the Wounded expedition. And there were 3 teams. These guys are the British team. There was also a Commonwealth team and a team from the USA. And they were racing to the South Pole, sort of bring up those ideas of Scott and Amundsen racing to the poles 100 years earlier. But they were all returned veterans, so that's this whole Walking with the Wounded is related to returned veterans. But a lot of the imagery that they use, using a term hero, how it might be applied today, putting them in the footsteps of heroes from the heroic era, but this imagery of sort of man-hauling across the ice very much harks back to that. These days, if you go down to Antarctica, you will have your Haglunds, you will have your helicopter to fly you into your field site and fly you out. But if you're doing something like this, you're kind of making a statement. If you're a tourist, you might also be paying quite a lot for the privilege of, for instance, skiing that last degree to the pole. These guys, the idea was to have a race. They ended up working together. But also, just the language that's used too, like the spirit of a nation, bringing up these very nationalistic ideas, particularly in the UK, because they still have a claim on the Antarctic Peninsula. And they were the ones that, the claims, New Zealand's claim and the Australian claim, were made under their flag as well. But of course, spirit too, and it is a whiskey from Glenfiddich. So these ads were showing up all around London in tube stations around the time of the expedition, just a couple of years back. So again, place for heroes, that nationalism, that masculinity as well. And in this case, there were actually women involved in the expedition, but all of the imagery is very much echoing that heroic era when it was just Antarctica was in male domain. As recently as the 1950s, people were lamenting the day that women came down and disturbed the great white womanless continent. So. And this one here too, because we've had a whole lot of centenaries, I said that heroic era was about 1899 to 1922. So we've been going through a whole period of 100-year celebrations recently. And as a result of that, quite a few companies have re-released different products. Things like Huntley and Palmer's remade the biscuits from Scott's expedition, and they look like vomited porridge, but they sold quite well because of that Scott branding. And this one here, Jaeger wool as well. So Jaeger provided woolen clothing for quite a few of those heroic era expeditions. They were there, Scott, Shackleton, Amundsen, and they continue to call upon that link. For a 100-year celebration, they actually sent an expedition to the Antarctic, and then they did some photography down in the peninsula as well. So this is part of their new range, inspired by the heroic era. And they said to mark the centenary of Sir Ernest Shackleton's Antarctic expedition, in which he battled some of the world's harshest conditions while wearing Jaeger, we sent a team to retrace his steps. And this was a little bit more high-tech because you could follow their expedition with #JaegerAdventure, and they posted updates every day, so you could see what they're up to. And this guy here, this is Stephen Skinner. He was actually working 2 years ago at Port Lockroy, so it's the Antarctic Heritage Trust base in the Antarctic Peninsula. And he took quite a lot of pride in being an underwear model in the Antarctic, even if it was long woolen Jaeger underwear. Now, some of these themes to do with that heroism and those links with the heroic era have been reprised since, and they've been subverted and used for different purposes as well. And I'm going to try and show you this clip, and I'm not sure if it's going to work, but we'll give it a go. Alright. Go. No. Does someone know how to make it go? It's working? It's thinking? Did I break it?
It's not thinking, it's not, the beach ball is not turning up.
Oh no. Oh, it's not going to talk to you. Okay, we'll have a look at who it is. They're not very happy about it. So they're saying, what took you so long? I think you get the message. We've got two kind of explorers there. One lot who think that they should definitely be there, and one lot that is somewhat different. So that's an ad from 2014. I was actually in the USA, turned on the TV, and that's what came up. So it's Dora the Explorer, what took you so long to get here? And there's so much to say in that one about, if you've got heroic era figures, it's all about the masculine figures battling the blizzard, and then who's there but a young Latina girl with a monkey, post-Madrid protocol. You can't have introduced species. But it's quite a nice example because Dora is sort of an archetypal explorer from grown up at a certain time versus this really outdated version. But playing very much with that idea of explorer, of what's an explorer and what's a hero. And this one here is another example. This is probably my second favourite ad. And it's bringing up another idea. If we're talking about that heroism and it's sort of man versus nature, In this case, we have Antarctica as an extreme environment. So as a final frontier, as the ultimate testing ground, because it's the coldest, the windiest, the driest, the highest continent. And that's what these guys were playing on in this ad here from 1965. So ad for VW, thinking of ideas of extremity and as used in Antarctica. So we had a whole series of advertisements in Australia in the 1960s because VW sent down the Red Terror, as it was known, down to one of the bases where it was just used to hoon about, go up to the airfield, just generally get about the base. And then they did a whole campaign about how it was the first car in Antarctica, which it wasn't. We'd already had cars with Shackleton's expedition in 1909, but it was the first production car and it was the first one that made a big advertising campaign about it. And if you do that, it's quite effective at letting people know about your product. In fact, this one here, they redid the whole campaign in the USA as well, but they had to re-photograph it so that the driver was on the wrong side of the car, because of course Australia is like us, left-hand drive. That whole idea of this being associated with the Australian Antarctic program, the Australians had some US visitors, and they said, oh, we only knew about your base because we'd seen the ad, the little Red Terror. They might have been making that up, but no, it's quite good publicity for VW anyway, the idea of extremity. And other things that have used that same sort of theme are often machinery, sometimes things like watches, or in this case, anti-freeze, doesn't freeze down there, it's not going to freeze anywhere, watches as well, or clothing. So for instance, in this case, in 2013, North Face sponsored the snowboarder Xavier LaRue to go to the Antarctic Peninsula to do some snowboarding, to make a fancy movie that had their branding all over it. So still the idea of if it works down there, it'll work anywhere. And with those watches too, there are so many watch adverts that have used Antarctica. It's quite common also for watch adverts to just use extreme environments in general. Any of the in-flight magazines, when you're flying, you'll see at least a couple with Mont Blanc or sometimes Arctic, Antarctic. And it's been happening for a really long time. So Smiths were sponsoring Scott's expedition there, saying he used Smiths. In New Zealand, we had Edmund Hillary using Smiths on Everest and also down in the Antarctic. And of course, somewhere like Antarctica, where it's very, very large, very, very featureless in the inland, in the plateau, it's really important to have a correct timepiece, because otherwise you could easily get lost and not know where you were. These days you might have, of course, your GPS as well, but you'd really want to know the time so that you could figure out your location other ways as well. So a lot of watches drawn on that too. And sometimes it's quite unexpected things. So in this case, this was an advert on the ski lift at Mount Hutt a couple of years ago. And I used to live down there. I used to live in Methven, and it was just a holiday up the mountain that turned into a research trip, because once I saw one, I had to see all of the ads on the bars. So we had to spend all day there. That idea of extremity here, though, we've got things like the penguin. And penguins are often used as a shorthand for Antarctica. So penguins we find in the south, no polar bears. Only time they meet is in Coca-Cola ads, and we're not going there. So polar bears are north, penguins are south. Penguins often used as that shorthand for Antarctica. And in this case, we've got that word extreme. Antarctica painted as the most extreme place on Earth too, that coldest, highest, windiest, driest. Extreme sport as well. So these penguins were sort of doing snowboarding, doing parachuting. And there were different types of penguin too. They're not all Antarctic penguins, but don't look too closely. Penguin is often used for Antarctica, regardless if it's an African penguin or Magellan penguin. Not often little blues, but anything black and white. In this case, it was placed on that ski chairlift, so you've got snow around, you're looking through the snow to see it. And it was an ad for paint, so resin paint that was white, And if you go on their website and read about it, they're saying, oh, paint your house with this paint. It reflects the sun, it keeps it cooler, and it's friendly for the environment. So quite a few different links there too. It's extreme paint with extreme sports, with extreme plays. And then you have other kinds of extreme. I was having a conversation earlier this afternoon about Antarctica and music and what you think of with Antarctic music. And quite a lot of people would think of violins and sweeping symphonies, maybe Ralph Williams or something. Well, Metallica does actually have links to the Antarctic. 8th of December 2013, they became the first band to perform on all 7 continents in the space of a year. So this idea of extremity, extreme environment, and collecting a set of 7. And this comes through in so much tourism things as well. If you run marathons, you can go down and do your 7th continent marathon on King George Island. 7 summits, you go down and climb Vincent Massif, for instance. So in this case, they had to fill in, it's about 120 pages of environmental impact assessment before they went down, and silent disco style to not disturb the penguins. But they became the first one in 1 year, all 7 continents. And what's kind of interesting on that one too was the sponsorship agreement. You see there, they were affiliated with Coca-Cola Zero. So those connotations of 0 temperatures, freezing at 0, 0 sugar, 0 impact, and 0 precedent. So a lot of these activities that actually take place in the Antarctic now are very carefully orchestrated. But it's not such a new thing, because if we look back to those really early adverts, they were really carefully thinking about composition, what sort of things do we need to take, what sort of media agreements and sponsorship do we need. So it might look a bit strange and incongruous, but it has a really long history. These guys here too, another way that extremity can be used is with this idea of absence. We had a whole series in the 1960s of ads for airline companies that said, that's the only place we don't fly. No one really expected them to fly there. It was just the idea that they go absolutely everywhere else. And same this one on the right there, the land of no Steinways, just in case you were wondering what pianos are used down there. If there was a concert hall, there would be one. And this one, these ones here actually were kind of interesting too, because the Pan Am one has just about the same tagline about the only place we don't fly, except Pan Am did fly down there. Pan Am actually took one of the flights down to McMurdo and into South Pole to take the first woman to South Pole Station. And they ran that ad series afterwards, so it was sort of the public image they were wanting to say was, look, no one actually wants to go there anyway, we'll go everywhere else. One of these other ways that Antarctica has been used, so these ones that we've looked at so far, have sort of been about people in the environment doing things. Another way Antarctica can be framed is this idea of untouched wilderness and of purity and freshness. And that purity idea is particularly the case with products from Antarctica, things like krill oil, or with this nail ale, which they took some ice from Antarctica to brew into that ale and is possibly the world's oldest and purest beer. And we just won't go into the fact that there's quite a lot of issues with taking ice and can cause something of a diplomatic incident. That's fine. It's old and it's pure because it has Antarctic ice in it. And that's been used for quite a lot of alcohol advertising since then as well. So not only whiskies, but also things like Godet, where the makers go down on a trip and get inspired and make a range afterwards. So like that one there, the Antarctic product. Or that, I'll just come back as well, that background one with that cow, that was actually part of a series, and I'm not sure if you can read that tagline, but up here in the corner it says, forever fresh, almost. So pulling on the idea of freshness with Antarctica, and a little bit dark, because there was one with a chicken, one with a goat, one with a cow. And it's an ad for a fridge, so the fridge will keep your product very fresh. And there are so many adverts. Of course, it would be an obvious link between a fridge and a polar environment. Ones like these, you can't tell if it's North or South Polar, but the ideas that are coming through are used in both. So here a glacier, a fridge coming out, and it's talking about fighting global warming, buy our product and protect this environment. And that's a theme that's come up in the last 10, maybe 15 years associated with Antarctica, kind of come out of this purity idea. This one here, I came across this last week actually. So I live in Tasmania, and this is a local product. They talk about how the water is blown from the Antarctic to Tasmania, where it rains down and makes our gin. So it's glacial cut, bracing Antarctic from gin. And then we have images like this one here. So something a bit newer, 2007. But Antarctica and ice in general, north and south at this point, so images of carbon icebergs, melting ice, have been used in a lot of media as a symbol or shorthand for climate change and global environmental issues. And that also has come through in advertising. Takes a while when they're being used to illustrate sort of news stories before they filter through to adverts, but 2007 we have this ad for diesel clothing, global warming, ready. And I think you can see why that might have provoked a bit of controversy at the time. It's part of a series, so they took landmarks like the Eiffel Tower, like London Bridge, and they made it into a tropical environment. All of the others were CGI. This one here is actually a picture from the sub-Antarctic islands, but it's called Antarctica. So talking about a time when Antarctica no longer has any ice. And again, the type of penguin they are, it doesn't really matter because penguins and Antarctica and ice are very closely linked. But for my study, this sort of thing's really significant because it indicates that concept of climate change has permeated into popular consciousness enough for Antarctica, through the penguins, to be used as a shorthand for that kind of issue in a form of cultural production. And this did cause quite a lot of outroar, this campaign. So, Antarctica as a fragile environment. And some other ads take that a lot more seriously, not so tongue-in-cheek. So, for instance, 2008 ad from Westpac in Australia, how many banks does it take to change a globe? And that's like a light bulb. In Australia, they call it a globe. So it's a joke, but looking at the one penguin and making the suggestion that they're the first and everyone else will follow. Again, usually you see pictures of the penguins all in a row. But they did a whole series using that Antarctic imagery and suggesting buy our product and you're protecting this. Some of them, they were more explicit in that than in others. And then you've got ones like this here. So one of the issues, if you're thinking of Antarctica as a fragile environment that you want to protect, is how do you show change on that temporal scale? And this is an ad for a travel agency. And they did that by plopping a block of ice in the middle of a campus, this was in Copenhagen, and putting their little sign on it, rather dark, Antarctica, go before it's too late. So trying to advertise their travel agency, it's a student travel agency, not necessarily trying to get people to book to go there, but trying to raise the profile of that agency because they knew they'd get some coverage from that. Doesn't really ask any questions about what are the implications of going down to see something and the footprint that you would do to do that. It doesn't really question that, but it does bring up that association between Antarctica and melting ice. One of these other ways that Antarctica is being used more recently too is that it's been used to stand in for a whole lot of personal challenges. The question, what's your Antarctic, from the Shackleton Foundation, for instance. So this idea of transformation and Antarctica, a metaphor for challenge or a metaphor for change. So we've got these books that have come out, for instance, looking at, so Ernest Shackleton, who was an explorer, became a hero, has become more of an idea. So his reputation was sort of came to the forefront in the late 1990s, and he's been particularly well known in the USA, largely because it's said that he never lost a man, which is not actually true, because when he tried to cross Antarctica, 3 of his support men on the other side actually died. But that doesn't get in the way of a lot of these books about leadership lessons, or how to handle mostly a corporate environment using lessons from the Antarctic. Or you have things like the Great Mounts Antarctic Challenge, in which case they had some people going to Antarctica to do a trek, but they encouraged people back home to take on some kind of challenge and call it their Antarctic. What's your Antarctic? So much more metaphorical. And Great Mounts too, they were actually they've got a really long association with Antarctica because they sponsored Admiral Byrd's expedition back in 1933. They were title sponsors, and they want to keep that going. So some of the different ads we've looked at today, there are of course many more. Some of them being those endorsements from explorers, these days from scientists as well, who've used products in the south, making a direct link with the place. But also a lot more where they use these different ideas that are associated with that. So drawing on themes of things like heroism, drawing on themes of extremity as well, of purity, of wilderness, of fragility, and saying buy our product and protect this environment, or transformation and change. And those advertisements draw upon one or more of these tropes about the Antarctic to ascribe certain attributes to their own products, services, whatever it is they're offering. But all of these are informed by what has gone beforehand. They don't happen in a vacuum. They're building upon ideas to do with Antarctica that are already out there. And if we take these together, these ads, they can help us to reveal that cultural frame through which we view Antarctica. And they can show us also how our values and our priorities and the way that we construct that place in the imaginary have changed over time. So, how should we view Antarctica? There's not really one answer. How people will think about it will depend on their own values, their own Antarctic imaginary, and it's very much shaped by cultural inputs. But different lenses: purity, wilderness, protection. We could see it as a place for science, we could see it as a place for territorial gain, or we could see it as a place for profit. And all of these are ways it has been viewed at different times. And as we have different food and water shortages looming in the future too, it's likely that these will shift and change. They never just stay the same. So it's worth keeping an eye on Antarctica as we go forward. So coming back to that first slide again, and that question, is Antarctica really not for sale? I would suggest not really. Antarctica can and has been put to use for a whole range of commercial purposes over the course of its human history, and it holds many resonances, so take your pick. Just remember to always read the fine print. Thank you very much.
Hanne will attempt to answer questions if we have any.
Has anybody got into trouble down there trying to drag pianos into difficult positions, for this whole advertising thing? Have you ever sort of got yourselves in sticky situations?
Well, there is a whole story about one of the planes that was flying to one of the bases with a piano in it, and they thought it would look cool if they put it on an iceberg.
Right. So
they landed on the iceberg and took it out, and then realised it might not quite be long enough to take off again. So it was like floating around for a wee while, just in the peninsula area. All sorts of things happen down there, some of which are photographs, some of which aren't. I guess it depends on your definition of a sticky situation. But we've had like this one that I popped up here. Like Kate Upton was down there doing a shoot for Sports Illustrated, and she just about got frostbite, so that's a little bit tricky. The Oreo too, yeah. The Oreo was celebrating 50 years of Oreos, so came to visit Antarctica. I haven't heard of any absolute terrible disasters, that doesn't mean they haven't happened.
Are there similar imagery associated with the North Pole?
So I think in some of the cases, yes. Some of these themes are very similar. The ways more recently that ice is used, like ideas about fragility and climate, very, very similar between North and South. Some of these older themes as well, I think yes, but the time frame's a bit different. These days, the idea of heroism, for instance, is still around in Antarctica, whereas in the Arctic, because there's a native population up there, colonialism has kind of been questioned and said, well, you can't really say these things about a place that already had people. With Antarctica, no one was there, so it's kind of a clean colonialism, if you will. So I think a lot of the themes are still associated with Antarctica, but are not so much in the Arctic. What I would really like to see is someone do this project with Arctic imagery. And I was up in Alaska earlier this year at a meeting trying to find someone who might do it, but no one has quite yet.
I realized a lot of your advertisements were in English and they looked like they come from the Western world. Is it not so much a theme in other cultures, or is it just simply that you didn't look at those?
It's sort of more of a case that I have 3 years to do this project and the scope is pretty huge. So the ones that I'm looking at, yeah, they're coming from Australia, from the UK, New Zealand, and some from the USA as well. So they are all in English. That's not to say they're the only adverts. And I have collected actually quite a few also in Spanish, and I think, again, it would be really neat to do a comparative study with some that have been in different languages, particularly ones from Chile and Argentina with that territorial claim. But again, yeah, I have 3 years, and that was the scope of what I'm able to look at in that time.
Yeah.
I think some of the themes will be similar, but they may well diverge.
Or they certainly are in Germany. There are 2 or 3 that I know, but just in German. So they're like just translated.
And if you guys have seen any or you come across any ads with Antarctica, I'd love it if you'd send them to me because I'm still collecting them up. And they're so ephemeral. They show up, they're on a billboard for 2 weeks, and then they're gone. So it's good to collect them.
You hear that, ABI PhD students? PhD, 3 years?
Did you hear that, Paul?
On the conservation side, there are in history there are key photographs like an event that turned public opinion. On the conservation side, the imagery that's being used, whether in advertising or simply for environmental things, is that as strong as the advertising side? The imagery that is, are there photographs or images you can think of that really nails what's happening environmentally in Antarctica?
Well, there are the same images being recycled time and again, and Judith Williamson has written a bit about that too, because she did a bit of a study on Antarctic imagery, and that's sort of that polar bear on the ice floe for the north, or the calving icebergs coming down in the south. Probably the most famous Antarctic images still would be some of those ones from the heroic era, like the Endurance ship trapped in ice with the white flash coming up at it. But then a lot of times that photographs are taken in the Antarctic. It's like re-photographs. Go to the same places are accessible to have the same images showing up time and again.
You mentioned the Antarctic Artist in Residence program. It seems like there'd be some parallels, but also some differences between the sort of imagery and the messages that are coming out. In a way, they're there to market Antarctica to New Zealand or the rest of the world, in a sense. Have you looked at those images in relation to the advertising side of things?
I've seen quite a few of those images, particularly from Australia and from New Zealand. And I've spoken to some of the artists as well. So a lot of the National Antarctic programs will send down 1 or 2 writers, musicians, visual artists every year. And they give them very specific tours. They take them to the same places. They take them through the labs. If it's New Zealand, they'll try to take them up to the Erebus ice tongue. It's very much like a here, now go off and make something. And some of them have found that quite difficult because they can't really necessarily be critical of what they're seeing. So some do anyway. Some artists that I've spoken to have chosen to go down privately, or have come down with a university course because of that reason. In terms of the imagery that's created, quite a few of them actually play with this imagery that's already out there. Like Anne Noble, for instance, has made several Antarctic exhibitions. One of them, she travelled around New Zealand and Australia re-photographing Antarctic scenes, so at Kelly Tarleton's, at the Antarctic Centre down in Christchurch, photographing that and making that an artwork kind of commenting on how a lot of this imagery gets recycled again and again. But I think it does just depend on the artist, and because it's so few people going down, it's not necessarily that you see the same thing time and again. It will be more comment on that there are the same images happening.
So, thank you very much, Hanne. We have some nibbles and drinks here, so please help yourself after this, but if you wouldn't mind joining me in thanking Hanne for her excellent talk.